I do. Is this just click through here?
Click away.
Awesome.
There you go.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it. I don't know if, I think some of you caught the speech downstairs with the kids. First off, I just want to give credit to Brookfield Academy. Like, the kids are great. I know that at that age, I would have been swirling all over the floor or launching spitballs at somebody or something. These kids are much better behaved and actually paid attention. And I was sharing before the conversation too, that part of the reason I can talk about the Declaration and natural rights and natural law is because they've got the foundation and the structure from this school, which is why we all send our kids here, is so that they actually have this intellectual foundation. Someone like me can come in and kind of pick up on that, and they're going to get it. They may not get every single word of it, and that's okay, because some of those kids are pretty young, but they have that foundation, and it's building and it's growing, and I think that's incredibly important. And I do mean what I said. I myself, when I served, I know it was incredibly important, and I don't speak for all veterans, but this was for me. It was incredibly important to serve in a structure in a country where it wasn't about the whims of individuals, it wasn't about politics. We can talk after about politics, it's all pretty messy and ugly right now. But it was important that you serve a country, a set of ideals, and a people. And that's what made the sacrifice worthwhile. When I went to combat, ultimately, I knew friends, I had close friends who made the ultimate sacrifice. I wasn't put in that position, but I understood that if I was, that my service was on behalf of my people, my family, and on an institution, a country that I knew would be there for their future. That gave me peace of mind. And that's what I talked about with the kids in a different mindset. It was very different than some autocrat saying, hey, enlist, because we're going to go and take that land. Because that land has economic value for the aristocracy that runs this country. That's most military service throughout all of human history. Very, very different. Very, very different to have, call it skin in the game as a veteran, where it's, hey, I'm fighting for my people. I may not even like the commander-in-chief at any given moment, but I'm fighting for my people and for the set of ideals and for the structure. And that, to me, is what allowed me to serve, to always have peace of mind, to understand I'm contributing to something that I want to be there for future generations. So, for what it's worth, I know many other veterans feel very similar to that. So these slides, we'll kind of click through them. But I'll keep this kind of loose, and then we'll get to the point where you can fire questions at me if that's of interest to the crowd. I'm happy to answer. So, why did I join? So Jessie, my wife, is right back there. We met in college when we were 18. She hated me at first, so it took like a year or two. That was the thing. But even back then, I had this thing where I felt like I was going to join the military in one way, shape, or form. I thought my plan was, and she can vouch for this, I was going to graduate from undergrad. I thought I'd go to law school. I thought I'd eventually join the service as a judge advocate general, as a lawyer in the military service, which, great thing to do, but that was my plan. And then life, stuff, 9/11, all that kind of stuff happened, and the order changed of what we did and how we did it. So we had actually gotten married before I went into the Marine Corps. And what was it that made me think about serving beforehand? So, it was interesting. Emily, our daughter, spoke downstairs and read her Patriots Pen essay. She talked about all the service in our family, and that's true. And it's kind of shocking to hear it, because in the household I grew up in, there was no push to join the military, quite the opposite. But my grandparents had served. One in the U.S. Army Air Corps. He was with us until he was about 90. You could not spend 10 minutes with him without him telling you about the Army Air Corps and the invention of radar, and talking very much in depth about radar. So whether or not you wanted to hear about radar, and so I understood that service was very important to him. My other grandfather died before I was born, but he had served in the U.S. Navy. Emily alluded to it, but his wife, my grandmother, did survive. She was a nurse in the Nurse Cadet Corps over at what was Milwaukee County Hospital, and now today is Freighter. So that was her form of service during that time too, and she was very proud of it. So I liked, and here again, all the services are wonderful. They all have different cultures, they have different purposes. And so what I liked about the Marine Corps, take it for what it's worth, was because I did. I went around to all the services when I was in college to say, okay, like what makes the most sense for me? And the Marines were the ones who were like, I don't know, you can try, but if you're not good enough, we're going to kick you out. I'm like, okay. And that appealed to me. But that was very much kind of the attitude of especially Marine Corps officer selection of like, hey, we don't have a whole lot of officers. The Marine Corps had a very low, does still low officer to enlisted ratio. And I just like that attitude. And again, this takes nothing away because I know we have representatives from every service here. They all do incredible things. They do things the Marine Corps cannot do. I wouldn't want the Marine Corps doing because, you know, something about laser-guided precision missiles launched off of ships. Like, I wouldn't want a bunch of Marines doing that, to be honest with you. But anyway, so I always thought I would do this. The order of events changed with 9/11, so I wanted to go in combat arms. Combat arms is a delineation within the structure of the military where you are, think about it as more directly involved in combat operations. Everybody involved in the military is doing something incredibly important. I decided that, you know, combat arms made sense for me. And so the Marine Corps has the highest percentage of occupations that are allocated directly to what are called combat arms professions. The whole thing made sense for me. Wouldn't make sense for everybody, and that's perfectly fine. But I also felt that whatever I did in the military was going to prepare me for whatever came next. And I didn't know necessarily what that would be, but that was my take on it. And the Marines have great uniforms. All the services have great uniforms, but I really like those dress blues. And it worked. The marketing worked because, you know, I don't know if any of you remember, there used to be like these crazy Marine Corps recruiting commercials where like a guy would fight a dragon on TV, like with a sword. And I was like, that's awesome. Like, you do that in dress blues and look like. Anyways, this poster actually hangs like life-size in our garage, and it freaks people out because it looks like a person when you walk in our garage. My wife loves it, right? So the Marine Corps values, again, this will be focused on the Marine Corps because that is the service that I know the best. But you will please know that for each of the services, these values are very consistent across all of them. But honor, courage, commitment. That's the first thing you're going to hear as you're thinking about joining the Marine Corps. And that is the ethos that's going to get embedded inside your brain. Whether or not you want it to, you're going to hear it about 1 billion times. The words mean something. You are expected to uphold them. If you don't, the Marine Corps is very happy to show you the exit or restructure you until you finally understand it. Semper Fidelis, that's our motto, always faithful. So I love that entire attitude and the notion that you could join an institution that had raised the flag on Iwo Jima was just super compelling to me. So that to me was pretty cool. No better friend, no worse enemy. I've got a very graphic illustration of what that looks like on top. So this was particularly in combat operations in Iraq and later in Afghanistan for me. This was what was preached to us, that we as Marines, and this is true again of all the services, should be able to go from hot combat operations, trying to kill an enemy who is trying to kill you, or trying to kill other innocent people, to switching in the course of 10 minutes to talk to a group of kids who are nothing more than innocent and are caught up in the same fight. Incredibly difficult to do. Incredibly difficult to do. All the wars we have fought have had their own challenges, we being the American people. What was unique about our wars, my generation's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, was the challenge of trying to fight a hot war in amongst a civilian population and do that for an extended period with no front line. So every time you rolled outside of a position, a combat outpost, you were basically in a combat zone, but you were in amongst innocent people. And that's a very difficult situation for anyone to be in, super difficult for an 18 to 22-year-old young person, and to have to make those split-second decisions. And I think one of the things that we all struggled with is when people did make mistakes, they typically did it in an attempt to protect those they were serving with and their lives. And so when mistakes got made, we saw young people very quickly adjudicated in a way that was extremely difficult. And I mean, adjudicated either through military justice or in the court of public opinion. And that was extremely difficult. What our command tried to do in order to keep us focused was to preach this mindset of no better friend, no worse enemy, so you could switch between these two extremes as quickly as possible. My lesson learned out of this is the limits of what is actually possible and capable. And so there are limits to what we can actually affect in terms of combat operations. And it's something that I believe firmly more of our political leaders need to understand. We can say that we're going to fight a war and restructure our society. Very, very difficult to do in practice. All right, Marine Corps leadership traits. JJ did tie buckle. Jesse can attest to this. I would sit around and try and memorize this before going to officer candidate school because people would quiz you on it. And if you failed the quiz, bad things happened to you. And so this, you know, and again, we talk about Brooklyn Academy and 5 stars. These themes are consistent. What a person gets out of service in the military is having stuff like this pounded into your head, and it never really leaves you. In one way, shape, or form, it sticks with you. And do you have to evidence every single one of these traits every single moment of your day? No. But it's good to know that these things matter. The world would be at a better place, in my opinion, if more people did think about these things on a consistent basis. Judgment, justice, decisiveness, integrity, dependability, tact, initiative, enthusiasm. Boy, I have that talk with my kids. Show enthusiasm. Even if you're not enthusiastic about it, look like you're enthusiastic about it. That can get you through some trouble at times. Bearing, unselfishness, courage, knowledge, loyalty, endurance. So these things, and the reason that an institution like the military and the Marine Corps talk about these things all the time is because they know that your job is going to consistently put you in difficult to miserable situations. And you got to have this kind of thing to fall back on. I'll remember, like, in training, which was nothing in the grand scheme of things, I was at, it's called the basic school. So Marine Corps officers go to officer candidate school, then they go to a 6-month training program, the basic school, in Quantico, Virginia. I don't like Quantico, Virginia. It is humid, miserable, everything that grows there is poisonous, and there's tons of just horrible insects that have and carry diseases. But that's why the Marine Corps got that land. They're like, this is the worst place in Canada. So they grabbed it. And they threw us in those woods for months at a time. And one day I was doing land navigation, because that's actually a huge part of training. With compasses, they send you out with a map and a compass. You gotta just find your way around. And you gotta get to these discrete boxes, which are hidden in miles and acres of woods. It's a good time. Real good time. Is it done because that's what we're still doing in combat? No, we've got all sorts of technology to help get us around. It's done for the physical, the mental, and the emotional strain that it puts on you, and that you actually have to, like, fight through this thing. And I remember one day in particular, it was hot, it was humid, which is pretty much every day. I was in the middle of the woods by myself. There was a stream. I had my map and my compass. I shot it's called an azimuth. It was going to lead me to the next box. And I took 2 steps into what I thought was like a firm stream bed and sunk to my waist. And I was laying there. I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I get out of this? Because it's sucked down in the mud. And I was like, who came up with this? This is insane. I feel like I'm in a Vietnam movie. I look at myself, like, I'm covered in mud. I had to, like, roll my body out, because if I put more pressure down, it would sink further. So I roll myself out, get out, I'm covered with stinking mud, and I had like another 8 hours to go, right? Not even close to the worst thing I would experience in the Marine Corps. But being that young person, I'd never been put in a predicament like that before. And that's what the Marine Corps understood. Desensitizing you to those kind of strains and challenges and all that good stuff makes you better when there are actual and real bullets flying. And that's what I was telling the Marine Corps do really well. And this is the base foundation of building that kind of mindset. Understand, it is important to be decisive. It's important to adapt if your initial decision's wrong, to be sure. But you should be decisive and you should have integrity as well too. So how did this all change me? This is a story written on me in Politico. I don't like stories in Politico about me normally, but this is one paragraph I actually thought was true, written by a guy named Tim Alberta, who's gone on to actually a fair amount of journalistic success. But this is in 2017, and he was interviewing people who knew me before my time in the Marine Corps, and people who knew me after. And so, this is kind of a backhanded compliment. That wasn't all Nicholson had changed. Gone was the arrogant, swearing, collegiate people who knew Nicholson. The Marines described a quiet, button-down officer. You know, I'm glad he said it. I think I'd feel like a real jerk saying it to myself. But a ton of truth to this. Like, prior to my service, I think I was extremely confident in myself, my abilities. I thought I was pretty smart. I thought I, could lead people. And the Marine Corps kind of swatted that aside. They saw something too, otherwise they wouldn't have been taking my application in the first place. But their attitude was, you got a real long way to go, and you need to rebuild yourself along those lines. And so that arrogance that was certainly there beforehand, I would say was chewed up, spit out, and ultimately rebuilt in different ways. And I think, if I were to say it, what came next in my life, the things I have accomplished and the person that I am, I simply would not have happened in my case if I had not served in the Marine Corps first. So this is a bit of the training period. I mentioned TBS. The one on the left is me at the basic school. This is not me in the center, but I didn't have a picture of a drill instructor screaming at me. That was like the best I could get. They are super intense. For officers, it's officer candidate school, where you get treated more or less like that. For enlisted, it is basic training. And so you go through this kind of like cauldron of fire, people yelling at you, taking you out of your comfort zone, all that kind of stuff. And then for Marine officers in particular, then you go to that 6-month school, which is more about building military skills, leadership capabilities. That's the basic school. The guy I'm with on the right, Trevor Urista, is a friend of mine. He died in Afghanistan. I still have a hard time talking about that. This, I never even noticed. This blender here, he'd blend up these stupid shakes that he would He was a really great athlete. Didn't look it, but he could run like crazy. Really good guy. But he was killed by an IED in Afghanistan, and he was killed right before I went myself. So, and I was about to lead a counter IED team. So the whole thing was just it was a shock to the system. It was a reminder of like how real the sacrifice was. And we were never really separated from it, but it was a reminder. And it's why today when I talk to the kids, I try to frame this as, our family never came to ultimately know directly the level of sacrifice that Trevor Urista's family knew. And I don't want to say, because it's not my place to say, that they would use my words in knowing that his service had a purpose. But I do know that, from what I knew of Trevor, that's what he would say. That his service was purposeful, it had meaning, we understood we were undertaking risks. We believe firmly that the risks were justified by the purpose of the service. It does not take away from the pain. So I mentioned this in the speech downstairs too. This is our son Connor, who's now a junior. That's terrifying. But I shared this story. I don't know if everybody heard it, but basically he was born in January 2007. And we were coming home from the hospital. Jesse was in the back of the car with him. Our first trip with a kid. My company first sergeant called and said, "Hey, sir." I pulled over, because you can't drive and talk in base. They'll ticket you. So we were on base, pulled over, and he's like, "Hey, deployment got shifted up from, it was going to be like October. We're going to leave for California next week. You'll come back for like 7 days, then you go straight to Iraq." And so, again, the grand scheme of what happens in the military, it's not nothing, but it's not anything close to what other people have had to endure. But it hits you hard, because you got this plan, you have some runway here with the new baby, we're gonna get set as a family, I'll go in the fall, we're all ready to go, and bam, that all changes. So on the left, Jessie, always the planner, had me record stories that she would play for Connor, and we probably still have those somewhere too. Yeah. We should all listen to them. This weekend. This is Iraq in 2007. I love this picture. This is my platoon, members of my platoon in the bottom left. Smoking's politically incorrect, but it still kind of captures who these Marines were and what they were up to. It was a hard-charging group of people. Many of them had already been to combat before me. As a junior officer, you start as a second lieutenant, and your first typical job, and this is across most of the services, is to run a small unit. And so in the Marine Corps, that's called a platoon. It's roughly 35 to 40 people. And so as a lieutenant, you take charge of that unit, and you oftentimes are taking charge of a unit that's got people who have served longer than you. And in combat, they have served maybe multiple deployments. And stepping into that position and trying to lead effectively means showing them due respect. Like they are, and then too, the system is actually designed this way between officer and enlisted, that enlisted are expected to be technical experts in what they do, extremely good at what they do. And as an officer, you're providing leadership to that, but you don't necessarily have the same technical expertise that the enlisted Marine soldiers, airmen, and sailors have that you're working with. That requires, sure, a general understanding of their job and what they do, but it also requires that you give due deference and respect to people that you ultimately have to lead. In some cases, you might have to discipline. And it's an interesting balance. To do all that as a young person, it taught me quite a bit. That's me driving our mine vehicle. It's not really a mine vehicle, we just put the mine. I was a combat engineer in the Marine Corps, and a combat engineer on what's called the Combat Arms Division side deals with mines, explosives. We did a lot of stuff with IEDs over the course of Iraq and Afghanistan. So we really like to put mine signs on everything, which other people do not find to be funny. And this was my little pooch area down there. I had my Packers flag. That's where we were situated. And that was in Raqqa, Iraq, which is on the Euphrates, northern part of the country, in Al-Anbar. So, and when I was there in 2007, as I mentioned, we got surged, we got moved up. It was President Bush gave the speech the night after Connor was born. The night he was born, okay. And I thought at the time, I did think, well, this could change things. I didn't realize how quickly. But we went in the surge and we saw things go from, during this deployment, which was 7 months long, we saw things go from extremely bad to relatively good in a short amount of time. The atmospherics changed pretty dramatically, actually. Again, we could spend a lot more time if you have questions. I'm happy to talk about it. Ultimately, the gains we made were later largely lost, and that is the difficulty of doing this type of counterinsurgency and getting the change to take. This is my full platoon, great group of people. Somebody was asking before if I stay in touch. I stay in touch with some of them, not all of them, and I feel guilty that I don't talk to them. This is me issuing promotions. This group of Marines they're basically being promoted right now. Actually, no, this is a re-enlistment. These Marines actually re-enlisted during this time. I was issuing it out before they did that. And this is me looking like I'm on the move. I should not have had my helmet off. We call them Kevlars in the Marine Corps with my helmet. I would have gotten in trouble for that. So we did Iraq, then we came home. You see the change in Connor in that brief amount of time. He still looks a lot like the guy on the left. Still wears that hat, which is super awkward. Just kidding. I got to wear my dress blues. I was pretty happy about that, because remember, that's a big part of the reason I joined. And strangely enough, just the way the combat operations worked, I didn't wear the dress blues very often, because we weren't going to parties and stuff like that. I probably wore them less than a dozen times, maybe. They were also tailored when I had pneumonia and I was sick, so they never fit correctly. Also very normal. So I was home from November 2007 through like spring of 2008, I think. Then I went to Afghanistan. So I extended my stay in the Marine Corps to serve in Afghanistan. I wanted to do that. Many people deployed more than I did during my time in. To be clear, I had sergeants who had deployed 7 times in some cases, so I felt like, yes, I wanted to deploy again. So I volunteered and I took what was called a counter IED team. And so our mission was to fight the improvised explosive device threat that existed in Afghanistan. And I had a joint team, which meant I had Air Force, I had Navy, I had Army, I had civilians, and I had one other Marine that served with me too. That team changed over time, but that's a fair amount of that team. They actually, this team built that building behind them themselves. That was not their specialty. They weren't CVs. CVs build stuff. But we needed a lab where so the whole, this is how crazy this operation was. We were part of a task force that basically had to fight the IED threat. When I showed up to this part of Afghanistan, which is in Kandahar province in the south, that's the way the enemy fought. They fought with IEDs. They did not do what's called direct fire attacks, which means shooting you with a rifle, because it was extremely flat. The terrain was very flat. So what they did was they put bombs in the ground basically anywhere that 2 trails crossed. There was 2 trails crossing, you knew there was an IED there, the question was, were you going to hit it or not? So it was important to have a counter IED group. Well, when I showed up, the problem was the IED group had nowhere to process the evidence, because we actually took these bombs and we processed them to get biometric data off of them so we could find the bomb makers. We couldn't process it, so everything got sent to a lab elsewhere in Afghanistan where it sat for months, so it did no good. Also, they had no vehicles or way to get around, so they would have to hitch rides with people to go out to these bomb sites. The whole thing was crazy. So I was able to convince the unit commander to basically give me a platoon of soldiers, Army soldiers, and we made that into a quick reaction force. Because this group had incredible carpentry skills, we built that building. I take no credit for it, they did that. And we built a lab there on site, so we basically sped up the processing time by like 6 to 12 months. So we started to get the actual biometric data, and then we could actually roll out on our own to every single device or detonation that occurred in the area of operations. So that was the good news. We increased our capabilities a lot. We helped the units that we supported a lot. The downside was it was like whack-a-mole, because in essence you had terrorists who were terrorizing not just us, but the local national Afghans. They were terrorizing them as well, who were putting so many bombs in the ground that we were just keeping up to be able to find them, to deal with the detonations when they occurred. And here again, I've talked about the limits of this type of counterinsurgency. I always tell this story because I think it kind of encapsulates it. A bomb detonated at the intersection of a road and a driveway that led to a compound. And there's very often these multi-generational compounds in Afghanistan. Walls are built around them. There's multiple residences. Usually an elder lives there, elder couple with their children and grandchildren. Well, this bomb was right at the intersection. And so fortunately, the vehicle that hit it, no Americans, no local Afghans were killed. But a vehicle was disabled. So we went out to recover it, to deal with the bomb site. And I was talking to the elder that lived in the compound. I had a translator. And I asked him, so I can see in the tire tracks that you've been driving around this crater for months probably. So you knew there was a bomb here. And he said, no, I didn't know there was a bomb. This is every conversation I ever had in Afghanistan, by the way. You got asked the question about 10 times. And I'd say, well, it looks to me like you did. Because I can tell from the last rain that this is all baked over and you've been driving around it. So how did you know? I said, I don't know. Inshallah, God took care of us. I was like, okay, sure. How did you know? And this went on for like 10 minutes. And finally, he's like, look, here's the deal. They are out there now, the Taliban, watching this conversation. I don't know where they are, but they're there. And when you leave, they're going to come here, and they're going to threaten to kill me and my children. They're going to take our food. What would you do if you were me? And that's true. We were there during daylight hours for the most part. We had terrible night presence because we didn't have enough troops. And at that moment, you were hit in the face with the limit of this type of operation to understand why it was so difficult to quote-unquote win hearts and minds. And again, it's not an argument against attacking the Taliban, 100% the right thing to do in my mind, but to understand that for the next 20 years, we did not have a clear strategic purpose. And that was very, very difficult to actually go to deploy and to try and build on something when the end state wasn't really clear. So, at the time, officers don't normally sit in turrets like this. We were short-handed and I did it. So if you're going to do it, get some cool pictures, right? And there we were, holding the flag. Okay. So we got out in 2009. This was actually one of my last days in the Marine Corps. We had an award presentation, so you can kind of chart Connor's growth here as we go through this process. The reason I have these logos on here, and I know Linda read my bio, it's not like, oh, isn't it cool? It's, I wouldn't have done this stuff if I hadn't joined the Marine Corps. Now, there's other people who could do this stuff without joining the Marine Corps, and more power to them. I could not have. There's no way. Our next step was grad school. I actually found out I was admitted to Dartmouth when I was in Afghanistan for a business school. It was a very muted feeling. You're like, oh, that's good. And we're going to go out in 10 minutes on a mission. So, but it was a good thing for the next step in our life. I ended up doing a joint degree between Dartmouth Business School and the Harvard Kennedy School for government and policy. It was a great experience. I learned a ton. I learned a lot more because what I had already, the foundation that was set for me in the Marine Corps. It grounded me. Talked earlier about the arrogance getting knocked out of me. I never had any illusions that I personally would not have done these things if I had not done the Marine Corps first. I would say I gave the Marine Corps a lot. It gave me more. That's my honest opinion. I got out of graduate school. I went to McKinsey. That place is a blender. It's really tough. It can be miserable to work there, to be honest. They really pound you hard. And on more than one occasion, what kept me going there is the same thing that kept me going in the Marine Corps. It's like, hey, one foot in front of the other. This does kind of suck sometimes. I was on the road 4 days a week without fail. And, you know, your mental adjustment is, well, I've been through worse. And so I can certainly handle this. And from McKinsey, I went to a place called J. Smart for a while, and then I just started my own firm, Fidelis Advisory. And a few years back, my wife and I founded our nonprofit, No Better Friend Corporation. So you can tell where I get my naming conventions from. Very limited imagination. Marine Corps fertile ground for that kind of stuff. So again, I put that up there because I will gladly admit, like I would not have done these things had I not first joined the Marine Corps and had that foundation capability. So that tells you a bit about why I did this, what I got out of it, some of the values that were pounded into me and to all of us who served, and how this kind of charted my life from that point forward.